my name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead for social studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. Today we're going to be looking at the question, how do I make sources accessible for students? As we know, primary and secondary sources are really difficult. Primary sources were never created in order to teach students. And oftentimes, secondary sources are done by those in the field of history or civics, economics, and geography, and are not always also designed for students. So it's going to be up to us to figure out how it is that we can adapt those sources for students K through 12. A reminder that we view sources as anything that can really be studied or analyzed. They can be written, visual, oral, any type of material. And they're synonymous with artifacts, accounts, documents, images, videos, whatever you might have that's been created by human beings. Because we want to make sure that we have plenty of sources that give perspectives, that are of different types, and that the sequence of those sources and the intertextuality of how those sources talk to each other matter in the way that students are learning. But ultimately, the biggest gatekeeper is going to be how complex those sources are, which is why today we're going to spend some time diving a bit deeper with some examples of excerpting, annotating, and modifying sources for greater access. So how do I adapt sources for my students? Accessibility is, again, as I just mentioned, one of the biggest gatekeepers. And if sources are essentially anything that can be studied or analyzed, well, those sources can actually do a lot for us. They can spark curiosity, they can deliver content, they can support arguments, and they help build a world, both historical and contemporary, for students to investigate. Without sources, students cannot answer supporting or compelling questions with fidelity. It becomes nothing more than conjecture. So sources must be adapted for students to be able to use so they can broaden their understanding of perspectives and content in order to better answer questions. So let's take a look at 3 ways of making sources more accessible. The first is an excerpt. An excerpt is a narrow text focus to focus specifically on the alignment to the task and the question. If you have an example of a 15-page document, do the students need all 15 pages? The answer is probably not. So what part of that document do they need that's going to align to the task, align to the question, and align ultimately to the standards that are aligned to that question? How much is too much? How little is too little? That's something that we're going to investigate. When it comes to annotating, what we mean is to provide context, explanations, to help provide significance, look-fors, and meaning inside of a text. Oftentimes students are completely unfamiliar with contextualizing a source. And an annotation provides a way for students to get a quick glance at what a source might do or mean before they really dive into it. Finally, when we say modify, there's a couple different ways of actually modifying the source. The other 2 are just enhancing the access to the source. But modifying means that we put our hands into the source and we begin to change a few things about it. The first is the use of parentheticals, being able to put those into the source so it's least disruptive. Maybe labels onto maps or to timelines. Word banks at the very bottom so that students are able to access that terminology very quickly. And perhaps even the most extreme version of this is rewriting the document to begin with. So let's dive into each of these individually. When it comes to an excerpt, I like to think that there's a Goldilocks zone when it comes to aligning a supporting question. Too much or too little can confuse students. If students only need 50 words to really understand a point of view or to deliver certain content, or whatever you might want for that source, they don't need to read 5,000 words to get those 50. We just don't have that kind of time. Unless the entire lesson is built around that larger element, in which case you're probably not going to be excerpting. When it comes to excerpting, teachers need to make sure that that excerpt helps students answer the question. Otherwise, students are going to be confused about why that question and source are together. They'll want to make sure that they align that excerpt to disciplinary and inquiry standards, and that ultimately the excerpt helps support, enhance, or build knowledge with other sources. Finally, I'll say about excerpting is that we want to make sure that the best excerpts provide space really for two things, sort of living at the surface so that all students can access that understanding of a source, but also providing for deeper dives to spark curiosity and to deliver content. So excerpts have to do a lot for us, and it's the first way of making sure that a source is adapted through its alignment with a question and a task. When it comes to annotation, annotations, again, remind you, are about providing some background information about what's going on. And what I've seen being used and how I use annotations is really to do three major things. The first is to clarify, right? So teachers would then write to help simplify the source in simple terms that give students the gist of the source. Kind of like a movie trailer might give you the understanding of what the movie might be about. When it comes to connecting, oftentimes these annotations are written to connect students to standards, maybe using the language of the standard, prior knowledge, or even other sources. And finally, an annotation can help contextualize, wherein a teacher is able to provide a historical understanding and background knowledge that might be necessary to understanding how that source came to be. The best annotations provide support for the source without taking away any of the source's authority in the inquiry. One of the teachers that we've been working with has caution for annotations, that too often students will actually look to the annotation rather than the source itself for an answer. That might mean that you might need to further modify the source to make it more accessible, or that you might think about removing some of the annotation to still provide that authority within the source. It is the source that matters, not the annotation. The annotation is just the small little bridge that helps you access that source's power. Finally, when it comes to modifying, we can do this in a couple different ways. One, right, and these are basically different scaffolds, by the way. One is sort of internal parentheticals to address vocabulary needs for easy synonyms. For example, whenever I taught the Communist Manifesto, proletariat, bourgeoisie, very important terms, I did not want to remove them. And so in the parentheticals, I just put proletariat, parenthetical, working class, right? I know it's not as simple as that when it comes to understanding it, but it does provide some larger view for the students so that that term is no longer scary to them. The second scaffold that you might build in is a word bank with definitions at the very bottom of a source with the vocabulary term in bold. I'll give examples of this in a second. We do not recommend that you spend days prior to building out word banks for vocabulary. Research shows that vocabulary disconnected from the source and context in which it's being learned does no one any good. Finally, the third scaffold is rewriting the source in a lower lexile language while maintaining the ideas of the source. This is probably the most quote-unquote controversial of the three. But we do this all the time. It's a way of breaking down the language. For example, I have taken the Declaration of Independence and broken it down into a language for a student who was still learning sight words. Now you might say, but Ryan, you're robbing this student of their capacity to understand the words that Jefferson wrote. I'm not trying to be a new Jefferson. I'm trying to be able to get the student to be able to use that source to create an argument, not to have that student be impressed by 18th century language. And finally, the best modifications should be temporary. So consider how to best scaffold students towards their own independence in a source. So here's a few examples of modifying a source. This is using a 7th grade example. And at this point, you can sort of pause because at the very top is the most complete version of that source. But you'll notice that I've already excerpted, right, this source to begin with. I've not provided you an annotation, but I have provided an excerpt here that's looking at just this one source. In the first scaffold at the very top, you'll see internal parentheticals into the document, right? It's the least obtrusive view of a source. So for Sultan, we can have king, right? For maces, we can have ball with spikes, right? For emirs, we can have princes, and you can sort of see that students will be able to read those quite quickly. The second scaffold is using a word bank. You'll notice that I've highlighted some words there and then defined those down below. It's incredibly important that when defining these terms that you use the most simplistic language as you possibly can, because the goal, right, is not to complicate a term that students are having difficulty with. Finally, and again, you may have to pause to be able to see the differences in what I've done here, but I've actually rewritten the source in a lower Lexile language to try to use the terms that we might use today in a source that was written several centuries ago. This has been How Do I Make Sources Accessible for Students? And if you have any other further questions about this, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.